Virtual reality is the next big thing in gaming, is what we were saying 6 years ago when messing around with the Oculus Rift dev kit for the first time.
Ooh. Hi. That's mesmerizing.
A lot has changed since then. There have been a multitude of different headsets released, each one bringing new stuff to the table. Higher quality displays, increased refresh rates, innovative controllers, even wireless headsets. But as they say, the more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. And that's to say, ignoring the actual meaning of that proverb, that it's 2020 and there's still no games for these things. So, what do I mean by that? Because obviously there are games, just not many that are actually very good.
Jumanji: The VR Adventure released on Steam on the 17th of January 2018. Possibly the worst VR title I have ever played.
The market for VR games is flooded with software that feels much more like demos than actual full-length games. And there's a good reason for that. It's because, yeah, almost none of these titles are what you would call full-length games. There's a countless number of games that are either just doing the same gameplay loop over and over, are just ports of existing games, or are just very, very boring. It feels like a lot of these developers still think that doing anything in VR is bound to be fun and interesting just because it's in VR. The thing is, we've been playing VR for a while now. There's none of that charm left. If your game isn't doing anything to push the medium, you're just adding to the list of bland VR games that nobody wants to play anymore. And that really sucks, because in my eyes, there's so much untapped potential in the realm of VR, and yet, every time I look at the VR store page, I leave disappointed. There is nothing on there that I want to play. And not only is there nothing I want to play, but there's nothing on this page that's made by any big name developer. I think one of the big reasons none of these games interest me very much is because the dev teams for these games are very small and don't have a big budget to blow. Making games that are innovative, fun, and full-length takes a lot of time and money, which is not something that very many indie developers have. And the people that could actually afford to make really cool VR games are instead making stuff like this.
How do I holster the stick? Whoa! Okay, that's turn. That's to do. Don't do that. That's jump. Okay, jumping is that. All right, that's weird. Nothing's working.
Really makes you wonder. VR is the next big thing in gaming. The biggest problem with VR right now is very obviously the high barrier to entry. Not only do you need a pretty powerful computer for most of the higher end games, but you also need to fork over the cash for a VR setup. And yeah, there's cheaper options out there when compared to the Index or even the Vive and Oculus headsets, but they're still not cheap, and at that point, you already know you're getting yourself into an experience that's not going to be as good as it could be. And so with the high price to get into VR gaming, there's a lot of people that are either unable or unwilling to make the leap. And all that just has to do with the price. That's not even considering everything I was just talking about before. The fact of the matter is that making the leap to VR is more like jumping into a pit, losing $500, and then acquiring a professional dust collector to sit on your shelf. As of right now, in my opinion, there is absolutely no way to justify buying a VR headset unless it's something you either really want or you can really afford without feeling it. Personally, I just borrow my friend's setup whenever I want to play VR, and whenever I have it, I get no indication that he even misses the damn thing. And that says something. There's a reason why most VR news is all about new hardware releases. It's because we've got all this goddamn hardware and nothing to do with it. And on top of that, VR is not something that I would consider super comfortable. I can usually only go for about 2 hours before either my legs get tired, I get too nauseous, or I get sick and tired of having the damn thing on my face. And so finally, with all of these factors combined, it's easy to see why the VR market is so feeble. Not many people are getting on board because honestly, they haven't been given much of a reason to. But wait, there might just be a sliver of hope on the horizon. What's that? A new Valve VR game? Half-Life? Okay, full length? 15 hours long? Half-Life Alyx is really, really good. It's not just an amazing VR game, it's just one of the best games I've played in a really long time. And to be honest, this is nothing new for the Half-Life franchise. And to understand why, we're gonna have to go back. You see, when Half-Life 1 came out, all the way back in 1998, it's over 20 years ago, the game was unprecedented. This wasn't like just any old shooter game out there. This was something more. A game with a deep and compelling world, great graphics for the time, and incredible AI.
Maybe not the whole military, mind you.
I don't mean to alarm you, but I do believe we have single-handedly wiped out the United States military.
The world was filled with NPCs that would actually walk around and talk to you. The level design was incredibly fun while remaining believable. The game made you feel like you were in an actual place rather than just, as Gabe Newell would put it, a shooting gallery. The game earned the title Game of the Year from over 50 different publications and is widely considered one of the best games of all time. To say the very least, Half-Life was incredibly innovative and incredibly influential on the gaming industry. Then there's Half-Life 2 in 2004. Once again, Valve had released a title that was way ahead of its time. Not only was the game, again, visually stunning for the time, and really fun, but it also brought more new stuff to the table. Most notably was the new and impressive physics engine. Never before had any game so thoroughly utilized objects in the environment as pieces to solve puzzles, to create pathways, and even as deadly projectiles. The combat in Half-Life 2 was also always interesting and changing. The game always has new twists to throw your way. Take for instance the manhack. When you're first introduced to these pesky things, you've got no choice but to just shoot them out of the air as soon as you can. But once you get your hands on the gravity gun, suddenly they become not a nuisance but a valuable source of ammo, becoming a sharp and deadly projectile to lob at the Combine officers who sent them at you. Eventually, you find a tool that can let you control the antlions. What once were your enemies are now your powerful allies. And in the later chapters of the game, your gravity gun becomes supercharged, allowing you to actually pick up Combine soldiers and launch them across the room. The whole game is about introducing mechanics and then twisting them to create gameplay that stays fresh, but still familiar. All in all, another really innovative and influential game. And so I look back at these games because I wanted to really sell the fact that Half-Life games are trendsetters. They single-handedly took the shooter genre and turned it from something that was overall pretty stale into something with a level of quality and polish that no one had experienced before. Valve sets the bar, and historically, they set it pretty high. And with Half-Life Alyx, the first full-length Half-Life game in 16 years, things aren't any different. Half-Life Alyx has set the bar. There has never been a VR game quite like Half-Life Alyx. Like I said before, up until now, VR gaming has been lackluster. The VR games out there pretty much just consist of you interacting with things in a small room, shooting at things in a stationary area, or looking at cool trippy lights.
That's mesmerizing.
Of course, there's a few notable exceptions. Specifically, one really notable exception, and so before I delve into the new Half-Life, I feel pretty obliged to talk about Boneworks. Boneworks is a relatively recent VR game released by the company Stress Level Zero. The reason I bring it up is because I do want to give credit where credit is due. The creative use of physics and melee combat used in this game is really cool, and most importantly, the game has a full-length campaign as well as other modes to play after you've beaten the game. It's also got a killer soundtrack. It's definitely a step in the right direction for VR games, and it's the first of its kind. Now, personally, I've had my fun with Boneworks, but I also have a fair few problems with its design. I think that while the gameplay introduced in Boneworks is innovative, a lot of the time it struggles to stay interesting. There's a feeling of sameness in a lot of the fights, and there's also really archaic saving mechanics introduced into the levels. Another big problem I had with it was that, while climbing on things in the game was mostly pretty fun, it did come at a huge sacrifice to my comfort. It's hard for me to play this game for any significant amount of time before feeling pretty sick. On top of that, the game has a really lackluster visual design. Most of the game is only half textured, which is explained by the game taking place in a virtual world or whatever, but to be honest, it's not a very appealing atmosphere and isn't very immersive. It doesn't help that there isn't much else to the story than you're in a VR game. Overall, I'd say it's good, but not quite there. And so finally, Half-Life Alyx. What does it do that puts it on another level than any other VR game out there? And for those concerned, there will be no major story spoilers in this overview. For starters, it's easy to see that this is the highest budget VR game we've gotten so far. The presentation is absolutely amazing. This game looks awesome. The level of detail in the models and the textures is fantastic. That along with great looking sceneries and of course your classic Half-Life sights and sounds. The level of immersion that this game reaches is unlike anything I've ever experienced before. There were several instances where I would end up playing for several hours and then wondering where the time had gone. This game does an amazing job of transporting you to another world and keeping you there, because the gameplay is also great. Fighting enemies in this game is a real treat. You get a total of 3 guns over the course of the game, each with different purposes. You've got your pistol for taking precise long-range shots, a shotgun for dealing out lots of damage up close, and a combine SMG for holding down the trigger and spraying down enemies. Each gun feels really good to use, and each weapon has its own unique way of reloading, keeping you on your toes in combat. Each weapon also has several upgrades that you can get by spending resin at these combine upgrade stations. The resin, along with extra ammunition and supplies, are used as an incentive for exploring your environment by being scattered around, hidden in desk drawers and other hidden spots. It might sound like a chore to have to scavenge around for stuff, but when the environment is as detailed and cool looking as it is, it actually becomes quite enjoyable. As well as the fact that it serves as a nice cooldown period in between fights. But what makes messing around with the environment even better is the addition of the gravity gloves. These are like 2 little gravity guns strapped to your hands. They don't have the same kind of firepower though. Call them what you will, but to be honest, they're just a great in-universe explanation for being able to grab objects from far away. This of course is a great thing for overall comfort when playing the game. It would get really old really fast to have to keep bending over to pick things up, and in many situations you can grab things from all the way across the room if you want to. Not only do the gravity gloves feel really fun to use, with a responsive flick of the wrist bringing objects hurtling at you, but also save the player a considerable amount of headache. Now back to the game. There are a bunch of different enemies to fight. There's your classic head crabs, zombies, antlions, and barnacles, but there's also new kinds of combine soldiers, electric dogs, armored head crabs, and a couple other scary things. This adds a lot to the variety of how the player approaches combat. It's a lot safer for the player to find a good piece of cover to duck behind when fighting against the Combine, but when you're fighting the electric dog things, you've got to constantly be on the move or you're definitely going to get hit. Just another thing in the list of many to spice up the gameplay and keep things fresh. Speaking of which, one of my favorite chapters in the game was Jeff, where instead of fighting the monster, the whole goal was to avoid it at all costs. The decked out zombie can't see but is hypersensitive to sound. You can use the various objects around you, mainly vodka bottles, to distract Jeff to make your way around. Not only is this gameplay something completely different from what you were doing just 1 chapter previous, it's also really terrifying. So overall, Half-Life Alyx was an amazing experience. Not just as a VR game, but as a game in general. It's one of very few games out there that doesn't just rely on VR as a gimmick. And I think it's what I would call the first real standout VR game, with a full campaign, high quality visual and sound design, stellar gameplay, and in general just a professional level of quality on every front. It's a great game, but does it make buying a VR setup worth it? No. Not even close. Imagine if some company tried selling you a console with 1 game on it and some tech demos. No one in their right mind would buy that. As of now, I personally see no reason for anyone to purchase even one of the cheaper VR models, let alone an Index. However, I will say that this is a step in the right direction. So is Half-Life Alyx the stepping stone that VR needs to get out of the realm of just being a gimmick and become something mainstream? I really wish it could be, because this game has honestly shown me how great this medium is and how much potential it has. But in the grand scheme of things, Valve is just one company. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that they're the quickest at releasing games. There needs to be support from many more AAA companies if this thing's gonna get itself off the ground anytime soon. Because as of right now, there's currently too few people with VR for these companies to want to develop games for it, which means there's no games for it, which means no one wants to buy it, because it's already too expensive for a lot of people. I mean, other than Half-Life, have you heard about any other big and exciting VR titles coming out? Because I haven't. And honestly, I don't see that really changing in the short term. For the time being, people are gonna have to settle for community-created content in the Source 2 SDK and other small games that come out here and there. Honestly, I hope I'm wrong about this. I really want to see VR take off and become something much more interesting and complete than it is right now. Maybe all the AAA companies have secret VR projects up their sleeves or something, I don't know. So, is that it? Is VR dead? Well, I think we can all agree that for something to be dead, it would have had to have been alive at some point.